Ezekiel was not just a prophet. He was a messenger of visions that challenged the very understanding of what is sacred. On an ordinary day while the people were in exile, he had an experience that would change everything. A whirlwind of lights, beings of supernatural appearance, and spinning wheels, all unfolding before his eyes. Have you ever stopped to think about what it means to see the throne of God? What does this signify for us today, in times of uncertainty? As he confronted the divine majesty, Ezekiel not only witnessed images, but also received a mission that resonates even to this day. Are we prepared to understand what he saw? What do these visions reveal about the future of humanity? Each detail, each symbol, carries a weight that transcends time. What can these visions teach us about our own journey? And if Ezekiel were here now, what would he say about what is to come? Prepare yourself, for the unfolding story is more than just a narrative. It is a call for reflection and action. Let's explore the depths of this revelation together. When I think of Ezekiel, I can't help but feel overwhelmed by the historical context in which he lived. Babylon, during the 6th century BC, was a cauldron of uncertainties and changes. The people of Israel, exiled in a strange land, struggled to find their place in the world. I imagine what it would be like to be in Ezekiel's shoes, a priest who saw his hometown, Jerusalem, besieged and destroyed. He wasn't just a prophet, he was a man who bore the pain and loss of his people. The Babylonian culture, with its beliefs and practices, contrasted deeply with the worship of the one God that Ezekiel knew. This cultural clash must have been a constant challenge for him as he tried to communicate the divine message in a hostile environment. Exile forced Ezekiel to confront not only the reality of his people, but also his own identity. He found himself in a situation where hope seemed scarce, yet paradoxically, this also opened space for a new form of spirituality. The prophet began to develop a theology that was not limited to the temple in Jerusalem. Instead, he had to find God amidst the desolation of Babylon. Therefore, Ezekiel's mission was not only to warn, but also to comfort and offer hope to a people who felt abandoned. Additionally, the influence of the Babylonians on the Israelites is a crucial aspect to consider. Ezekiel witnessed his people being drawn to pagan practices, rituals, and idols that were alluring in the land of oppression. The Babylonian culture had a strong appeal, and Ezekiel's struggle against this influence is palpable in his words. He became a solitary voice in a sea of voices clamoring for worship of foreign gods. His steadfastness in remaining faithful to God, even amidst temptation, is a testament to the strength of character he possessed. Ezekiel also faced the difficult task of keeping the Israelite identity alive in a context of fragmentation. He used his visions and messages to remind the people who they were and what their history entailed. His role as a priest and prophet intertwined as he not only spoke of God, but also brought the rituals and traditions of Israel to the heart of his people, even while they were far from their homeland. This connection to Jewish history and culture was essential in keeping hope alive among the exiles. Ultimately, the historical and cultural context of Ezekiel teaches us that faith can flourish even in the most adverse circumstances. Ezekiel did not merely document the desolation around him. He became a beacon of hope. He shows us that amidst pain and loss, a connection with God can be a source of strength and renewal, a theme that resonates even today. When I read the description of the vision of God's throne in Ezekiel 1, I can't help but feel that I am confronting something truly extraordinary. Ezekiel presents us with a scene that challenges the imagination, a grand throne surrounded by intense light and celestial beings. He describes this throne with such richness of detail that it makes me want to be there, to see with my own eyes. The vision is a glimpse of heaven itself, a space where the glory of God is revealed in a way that had never been seen before. This vision is not just a demonstration of God's power, but also of His control over creation. The symbolic elements present in this vision are fascinating. The four living creatures, with their faces of a man, lion, ox, and eagle, represent not only the diversity of creation, but also God's omnipotence over all creatures. Each face seems to carry a profound meaning. I wonder if Ezekiel was aware of the magnitude of what he was witnessing. For him, this vision was not merely a curiosity, it was a confirmation that God was present even in exile. The throne, surrounded by a rainbow, symbolizes God's covenant with His people, even in times of crisis. Ezekiel also emphasizes the wheel within a wheel, an aspect that intrigues me deeply. The movement of these wheels, turning in opposite directions, symbolizes God's sovereignty. He's in control of everything, even when the world seems chaotic. This image of rotation and constant movement leads me to reflect on how our lives can also appear disordered. However, Ezekiel's vision reminds us that even when we cannot see the divine plan, God is always working in our favor. What impresses me most about this vision is how Ezekiel is called to be a messenger of God. He does not merely observe, he is summoned for a mission. This makes me think about the responsibility we all have in our faith journey. We are called to be witnesses of what God is doing in our lives and in the world around us. The vision of God's throne, just like Ezekiel's, challenges us to look beyond ourselves and commit to a greater purpose. Lastly, the vision of God's throne is an invitation to worship. By describing God's majesty, Ezekiel brings us to a place of reverence and adoration. It serves as a reminder that amidst difficulties and uncertainties, God remains sovereign. This vision inspires us to draw near to Him, even when our lives are filled with questions. Ezekiel shows us that worship is not merely a practice, but a natural response to the revelation of a God who is always present, even in our darkest moments. The four living creatures described by Ezekiel in his vision are undoubtedly one of the most intriguing aspects of his account. Each of them possesses unique and distinct characteristics that go beyond what we can see at first glance. They are not merely cosmic figures, they symbolize different facets of creation and the presence of God. To me, this is a powerful representation of how God manifests in various forms and how He is omnipresent throughout creation. The face of a man represents rationality and humanity, while the face of a lion evokes majesty and strength. The face of an ox symbolizes service and hard work, and the face of an eagle conveys sharp vision and the ability to soar high. Together, these faces form a comprehensive portrait of creation, showing that God is in all things and that each aspect of life has a divine purpose. As I contemplate these beings, I am reminded that we are not alone in the universe. We are part of a creation that reflects the greatness of God. In addition to their individual symbolism, these beings also function in perfect harmony with one another. The way they move in unison is a representation of the balance and unity that God desires for His creation. This leads me to consider the importance of community and collaboration in our lives. Just as the living creatures work together, we too are called to live in harmony with one another, recognizing that each of us has a unique and valuable role to play. Another fascinating aspect of the four living creatures is their association with worship and adoration. They are always in motion, always ready to fulfill God's will. This makes me reflect on our willingness to serve and worship. The Christian life is a journey of surrender and devotion, and the living creatures remind us that true worship goes beyond words. It is an action that should be reflected in our daily lives. The total surrender to God is a calling that we all must embrace. The presence of the four living creatures also speaks to the protection and vigilance of God over His people. They are guardians of God's glory and represent the strength and protection that He offers us. This image is comforting, especially in times of uncertainty. Knowing that God has celestial beings watching over us and that He is always attentive to our needs is a powerful reminder of His faithfulness and love. Finally, as I reflect on the four living creatures, I am led to consider how we can become more like them in our own lives. Are we willing to serve, worship, and work in harmony with one another? Ezekiel's vision challenges us to live in a way that reflects the beauty and diversity of God's creation. By embracing our role, we can become witnesses to the glory of God in a world that so desperately needs hope and light. When I read Ezekiel 37, I cannot help but feel the intensity of that scene. Imagine a valley filled with dry bones. These are not just a few scattered bones. It is a vast expanse that stretches out of sight. Ezekiel is taken by the Spirit to this desolate place, and the scene is undoubtedly one of death and despair. It's as if all dreams and hopes have been forgotten there, exposed to the scorching sun and the relentless wind. One cannot help but wonder, what happened to these people? What tragedy led to this state? The question God poses to Ezekiel is provocative. Can these bones live? This doubt hangs in the air, and the prophet in his wisdom responds, "Lord God, you know." This answer reflects both his faith and his understanding of the situation. He knows that, humanly speaking, the answer would be a resounding no. Yet at the same time, he acknowledges that with God, all things are possible. This interaction between Ezekiel and God serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most desperate situations, we must not lose hope. God then commands Ezekiel to prophesy over those bones. What happens next is absolutely phenomenal. As he speaks, the bones begin to come together, covered with tendons, flesh, and skin. It's a powerful image of restoration. What was once a symbol of death transforms into a representation of life. Ezekiel's act of obeying God's word and prophesying over the bones makes me reflect on the power of words and faith. Sometimes we just need to take that first step and believe that God will act. The vision doesn't end with the resurrection of the bodies. God reveals to Ezekiel that these bones represent the house of Israel, which feels cut off and lost. The people were desolate, without hope, exiled in a strange land. Thus, Ezekiel witnesses not only physical resurrection, but also spiritual revival. God's promise is that He will bring His people back to their land, restoring not just their lives, but also their identity and relationship with Him. This message remains relevant today, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, hope is a light that never goes out. The vision of the Valley of Dry Bones is, therefore, a powerful symbol of transformation and hope. It is an invitation to faith in times of despair. What profoundly impacts me is how God uses Ezekiel, an ordinary man, to accomplish this extraordinary work. It makes me reflect on the role each of us can play in bringing life and hope to the world around us. Even when everything seems lost, there is always room for recovery and renewal. Ezekiel was not just a prophet, he also held the position of priest. This duality is fascinating and reveals much about his mission and calling. As a priest, he had a deep understanding of the traditions and rituals surrounding worshiping God. However, as a prophet, he was called to challenge the status quo and speak on God's behalf in ways that could often be uncomfortable for the listeners. This combination is particularly powerful, as it granted him an authority that few could contest. In many of his messages, Ezekiel presents himself as the voice of God, delivering not only words of judgment, but also of hope and restoration. His role as a priest gave him an intimate connection with the religious practices of the people, while his prophetic vocation compelled him to confront the corruption and infidelity permeating society. This dynamic serves as a reminder that true spiritual leadership involves both worship and correction. By acting this way, Ezekiel shows us that we cannot be satisfied with mere ritualism. We must also live according to the principles we profess. Another important aspect of Ezekiel's role is his responsibility to be an intermediary between God and the people. He not only brings messages of warning, but also intercedes on the people's behalf, asking for mercy and forgiveness. This is an essential aspect of the prophetic ministry. It's as if Ezekiel is constantly balancing the weight of the people's sin with God's grace and justice. This tension is something many spiritual leaders face even today, especially when addressing difficult issues affecting their communities. Ezekiel's life also demonstrates that God's calling is not always comfortable. He often had to confront the harsh reality of the people's disobedience and rebellion. Ezekiel speaks directly, often using metaphors and powerful imagery to convey his messages. This clarity is an important characteristic of the prophetic ministry. It's not just about delivering a message, but doing so in a way that truly resonates with people's hearts. Ultimately, Ezekiel's role as both prophet and priest teaches us about the importance of integrity and authenticity. He lived during a time of great crisis for Israel, and his life and ministry were intertwined with the history of his people. The way he responded to God's calling, even when it meant facing rejection and scorn, is an inspiring example of faithfulness. Through Ezekiel, we see that being a true servant of God involves courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to fulfill the mission entrusted to us. When I read the prophecies of Ezekiel, one thing is clear. He does not hesitate to address both judgment and hope. The message of judgment is undoubtedly the hardest to digest. Ezekiel is not merely announcing God's wrath, he is exposing the failures and corruption that have taken hold of the people. What impacts me is the sincerity and urgency with which he conveys these messages. It's as if he is crying out in the midst of a storm, trying to awaken a people who are in a state of denial. According to Ezekiel, God's judgment is not arbitrary. It is a result of the people's unfaithfulness to God. The idolatrous practices, social injustice, and moral corruption are some of the areas Ezekiel addresses. He's not afraid to point fingers and call things what they truly are. This makes me reflect on the importance of having prophetic voices in our days. Those who have the courage to speak the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. However, Ezekiel does not limit himself to messages of condemnation. After every warning of judgment, there is always a promise of hope. This duality is essential to understanding the nature of God. He is a God of justice, but also a God of mercy. Ezekiel speaks of a future in which the people will be restored, where hardened hearts will be transformed, and where life will be renewed. This hope is like a beacon in the darkness, reminding us that even when we face the consequences of our actions, there is always a way back to God. The visions of restoration that Ezekiel presents are powerful. He speaks of the unification of the tribes of Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, and the return of the people to their land. This vision of a glorious future is an antidote to the despair that permeated the lives of the people. Through his words, Ezekiel is planting the seeds of faith in a better future, a future that can only be realized through divine intervention. In conclusion, the messages of judgment and hope that Ezekiel brings serve as a reminder that God's discipline is not an end in itself, but a means to a greater purpose. They teach us that even amid difficulties and consequences, there will always be room for grace and renewal. This understanding encourages us to turn to God, to seek Him in our struggles, and to believe that He can bring life where there was once only desolation. When I read Ezekiel's visions of Israel's restoration, I feel like I am diving into a universe of hope and renewal. It is remarkable how, in the face of desolation and captivity, Ezekiel delivers a powerful message that the people of Israel still have a future. It's not just about returning to a previous state, but about profound transformation. He speaks of an Israel that will be restored not only physically but spiritually. It's as if he is saying, "Do not forget who you are and what you can become." The vision of restoration is, for me, an invitation to reflect on identity and faith. Ezekiel mentions that God will not only bring the people back to their land, but will also give them a new heart and a new spirit. This makes me think about how often we struggle with our own identities and limitations. Ezekiel's promise is that restoration is not merely about physical return, but a genuine internal renewal. This resonates deeply in our lives, doesn't it? How many times do we need a new chance to rediscover ourselves? What fascinates me even more is the way Ezekiel describes this transformation. He speaks of the purification of the people and the removal of the idols that have distanced them from God. It is a message that echoes even today, in a world full of distractions and things that pull us away from what truly matters. The idea of shedding impurities and seeking a genuine relationship with God is an eternal lesson. The restoration of Israel, therefore, symbolizes rebirth and a renewed commitment to spirituality. Additionally, Ezekiel highlights the figure of the shepherd who will care for his sheep. This image is powerful and full of meaning. The shepherd is not just a leader, but someone who deeply cares for the well-being of his flock. This leads me to think about the importance of leaders in our communities and how they can be instruments of healing and hope. Care and compassion should be at the heart of any leadership. Ezekiel's vision reminds us of the responsibility we have for one another, especially in difficult times. Finally, as I reflect on the restoration of Israel in Ezekiel's visions, I feel inspired to seek my own restoration. The message of hope and renewal is timeless. No matter how far we have come or how many difficulties we have faced, there is always room for a new beginning. Ezekiel teaches us that restoration is a process that involves not only a physical return, but also a deep inner transformation, and this is something we can all seek in our lives. As I delve into the descriptions of the temple in Ezekiel, I feel as though I am standing before a masterpiece of spiritual architecture. Ezekiel details every aspect of the temple with impressive precision, making me reflect on the importance this sacred space held for the people of Israel. The temple was not just a building, it was where God dwelled among his people, the center of worship and community life. Imagining this grand place with its ornate doors and walls evokes a sense of reverence. One of the most striking aspects is the vision of a renewed temple. Ezekiel describes not only its physical structure, but also the presence of God dwelling there.
This connection between the physical space and the divine is fascinating. It's as if the temple symbolizes the relationship between God and his people. What does this teach us about the importance of places of worship in our lives today? We should remember that, just as the temple was a meeting place for God and the Israelites, our churches and communities should also be places where we feel the divine presence. Ezekiel also speaks about the roles of the priests and Levites in the new temple. This leads me to ponder the significance of service and dedication in our lives. The priests were responsible for maintaining the holiness of the temple and performing the necessary rituals for worship. This challenges us to reflect on how we can be more dedicated in our own service to God and to one another. The call to holiness and responsibility is something that should not be overlooked. Another fascinating aspect is the description of the space surrounding the temple, including the river that flows from its base. This river, which brings life and healing, is a powerful image. It symbolizes the abundance and grace that flow from God into the world. When I think about this river, I feel it also represents the transformation that can occur in our lives when we connect with the divine. Just like the temple, our lives can become sources of blessings and hope for those around us. Ultimately, Ezekiel's descriptions of the temple invite us to consider what it means to have a sacred space in our lives. In such a hectic world, it is essential to find moments and places where we can connect with God and renew our faith. Ezekiel's visions of the temple remind us that worship is not just a practice, but a way of life that should be rooted in each of us. The construction of the temple is, therefore, a powerful metaphor for what God desires to accomplish in our lives and in our communities. When I think about the relevance of Ezekiel's visions in both Christian and Jewish theology, I realize they are true spiritual treasures that transcend time. Ezekiel is not just a prophet of the past. His messages echo and resonate in our current doctrines and practices. The impact of his visions, especially concerning the restoration of Israel and the temple, continues to shape our understanding of God and our relationship with Him. It's as if Ezekiel put into words the human longing for connection and hope. One of the most significant aspects of Ezekiel's visions is the idea that God is a God of restoration. This message is central to both Judaism and Christianity. For Jews, the promise of return and restoration is a fundamental part of messianic hope. For Christians, the notion that God can bring life from death, as exemplified in the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, reflects the resurrection of Jesus and the new life He offers. This connection between Ezekiel's visions and the teachings of Christ is a unifying point that enriches both traditions. Moreover, the description of the temple in Ezekiel is often seen as a foreshadowing of the spiritual temple that Christians believe to be the body of Christ. This idea that God dwells among His people, no longer in a building but within each of us, is a powerful evolution of theological thought. This transition from a physical temple to a spiritual one reminds us that God's presence is not confined to a location but extends to all who believe. It's a message of inclusion and closeness to the divine that is essential to our faith. The relevance of Ezekiel's visions also reflects the importance of ethics and social justice. Ezekiel speaks not only of restoration but also of the need for justice and a purified heart. This emphasis on morality and social responsibility resonates strongly within both Jewish and Christian traditions. Justice should reflect God's nature in our lives, and Ezekiel challenges us to commit to this cause. It's a call to action that remains relevant in our times. Ultimately, as I reflect on Ezekiel's visions, I am led to consider how we can apply these lessons in our lives today. The promise of restoration, the centrality of the temple, and the pursuit of justice are themes we should embrace. Ezekiel presents us with a God who is always willing to restore, renew, and transform. This message of hope serves as a beacon that guides us, regardless of the circumstances we face. Thus, Ezekiel's visions are an invitation to live fully in communion with God and with one another, always remembering that restoration is possible. Hey there, everyone. Now that we've delved into Ezekiel's amazing visions, it's impossible not to feel challenged to reflect on what all this means for us today. Have you ever stopped to think about how the revelations of this prophet can resonate in our lives? Ezekiel didn't just see a throne, he witnessed God's glory in all its majesty, prompting us to ask, what is our role before such a powerful God?